When I talk about the addict personality, it is a separate personality that develops in my brain that non-addicts don't have. How many of you remember the first time you got into a car to drive? How many of you were able to drive perfectly the first time around? No. Because you were stupid and useless? No. You hadn't learned how to drive. So what happened is, when you learned how to drive, all the information about driving was stored in nerve cells in your brain. Okay, everything you learned about driving was stored in these nerve cells or brain cells. The more you practice driving, the more those nerve cells with all the information about driving started to connect. And you formed a neural network in your brain called the driver, with neural pathways. For the first couple of days or weeks, you have to talk yourself through the whole process. But then it gets to the stage where all you think is, I've got to go to the shop, and it's automatic behavior. You don't have to talk yourself through the... My personality consists of various neural networks like that. A neural network with my beliefs, a neural network with my values, a neural network with everything I've learned, my morals, all that kind of thing. And all those different neural networks work together, you've got John's personality. And then some of us go and start using drugs and alcohol, whatever. We develop a completely separate personality called the addict that is wired into the brain. And it works on pathways. Okay, mesolimbic pathways, we'll go into more detail. Limbic meaning the emotional center of the brain. There's a pathway that gets wired into my brain in the limbic system of the brain. And then from there, there's another pathway, the mesocortical. Cortical is the rational part of the brain, the cortex. There's a mesocortical pathway that gets wired into the brain. And that's where the statement comes from, once an addict, always an addict. It's never going to go away. Getting back to the driver network, if you stop driving for 20 years, and you're still alive after the 20 years and you get back into the car, can you still drive? Yes. Why? Because you've got this network that has been wired into your brain called the driver, is never going to go away. It might become disused, it might be a bit rusty, but you can still drive. The same with the addict. This is why the addict remains at risk of relapsing for the rest of their lives, because the addict personality can be reactivated at any time. We're going to look at rewiring, recovery into the brain later on. So how this whole process works, the addict picks up for the first time. This applies to everything everybody does with every experience. But for addicts, there's a problem that comes in. The addict picks up for the first time. He feels a lot of emotional pain, depression, experiments, and he finds the drug of choice. Wow, this is what I've been looking for all my life. That wow factor is the start of addiction. The intensity of the wow factor. So there's the experience of picking up. That experience triggers a neural network in the brain called the VTA, ventral tegmental area. That area contains neurons that releases a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is the enjoyment chemical, the pleasure chemical. They're looking forward to things. If you get a phone call to say you've won 2-week holiday in Mauritius, how are you going to feel? Wow. Why do you feel that way? Because of the phone call? No, it's because of the dopamine release. You're thinking a certain way about the phone call, your body releases dopamine, and you feel excited because your VTA was triggered. Now, the intensity of the experience of picking up determines how much dopamine gets released. I've had people saying to me, I tried cocaine, it didn't do it for me. What they are saying is, when I tried cocaine, there wasn't a lot of dopamine being released. Another person says, wow, this is what I've been looking for. Because there was an intense experience, a lot of dopamine was released. Now, my take on that is, the level of dopamine is determined by the level of the need being met at the time of picking up. The person who said, I tried cocaine, didn't do it for me, didn't meet the need. didn't make them feel any better. But for the person, the wow was, wow, it made me feel what I've been longing for all my life. It was an intense experience, a lot of dopamine. From the VTA, the dopamine flows to the nucleus accumbens, which is another structure with neurons that releases a chemical called glutamate. Glutamate is the memory chemical. So you've got the intense experience. Now I need to remember how I can have the same experience in future. That's where the glutamate comes in. So the dopamine flows to there, releases glutamate, and the memory starts to develop. If I have a line, I feel on top of the world. The feeling of on top of the world, the memory how to do it, you only have to do it 3 times for it to start forming this neural pathway. It becomes automated. I feel stressed. The memory of I can feel better. The memory of what I need to do is within 30 milliseconds. It gets triggered. 30 milliseconds means we're not even conscious of the fact that it was triggered in the brain. It becomes wired into the brain. From there, the dopamine and the glutamate together goes to the prefrontal cortex, which is the rational thinking, logical part of the brain. And we develop a conscious memory. We can actually talk and tell somebody what we felt when we used that. And in some instances, we might even start to make suggestions. You know what? You feel depressed right now. You know what I did? Why don't you try the same thing? Because now it becomes a logical, rational memory. And the more we do that, the more these pathways become ingrained in the brain. And the more we do that, the more intense the experience becomes, for a while at least. But then it gets to a stage where damage starts to take place. This part of the brain becomes damaged in the sense that in order to protect itself from overdosing, it slows down its natural dopamine release to protect itself. And of course, the less dopamine it gets released, the more the addict uses for the same high. And the addict never experiences the original rush ever again. Never ever again to the same extent. So they try to recreate the original experience. They use more, and the more they use, the more the neurons that release dopamine start to shut down. That part of the brain becomes damaged. So the addict develops a condition called anhedonia. The inability to experience simple pleasures, because that part of the brain has been damaged. Somebody can really have a good time going to the movies. They can have a dopamine release going to the movies. The addicts think, what the hell? Are you mad? Who wants to go to movies? Because going to a movie does not release dopamine for them anymore, because that part of the brain has been trained. The only way I can release dopamine if you send a huge amount of drugs into the system that can start to release dopamine again. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Because these neurons all were activated in this experience, they wire together and form a pathway. And that's the addict personality that starts being formed in my brain, with the beliefs of the only way that I can feel good is by using, because I can't experience simple pleasures anymore, and the memory of how to get that experience is wired into my brain as well. And the more you practice it 721 days, it becomes more ingrained. It becomes a habit thing. The old neurons that are damaged or destroyed will never be revived again. But we can develop new ones. It's called neuroplasticity. We're going to look at that. And that's where, when we talk about recovery, we look at all those kinds of things. So not only is this behavior wired into the brain, some of the damage can be irreparable. That's why a lot of addicts suffer from depression, because they can't experience pleasure anymore. They think there's something wrong with them. They feel down, they feel listless, and of course they're going to either cross-addict or increase. Especially in recovery, the first couple of weeks and months in recovery, they can feel depressed, because it takes up to 2 years for those parts of the brain to heal, where it can naturally produce enough dopamine again to enjoy a simple experience. And not 2 years of going through recovery through osmosis, active working of recovery, which we'll get to.
So that is the same for all forms of addiction?
All forms of behavior.
Gambling.
Absolutely. Guys, this is the basis for all behavior. The problem is the intensity of the original experience, the amount of dopamine that keeps taking me back to the behavior. And then over time, those parts of the brain are being impaired. So I can't experience pleasure anymore without using. And the memory that says the only way I can experience pleasure is by using. The more intense this becomes, the more this emotional center, limbic system of the brain becomes stronger and stronger. And the thinking part of the brain over time starts to slow down in functioning because of the impact of the drug. So the executive functioning, the thinking, the decision making, the self-control, all that kind of thing. In a healthy person, there's a balance between the two. I feel really excited, but my rational mind stops me from doing stupid things. And that's what EQ is about. It's a balance between the rational thinking part and the emotional part of the brain, or maturity for that matter. Children, this is underdeveloped, they act out of emotion. A person who shut down the emotions, rationalize everything, there's no real intense experience. In addiction, this is gone. It's all about survival. I want that feeling. The only way I can survive is to have that feeling. So not only do addicts suffer from a condition called anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure, they also suffer from a condition called hypofrontality. Hypo meaning below a certain level. Hypofrontality means my rational part of the brain is not working anymore. I become like an animal, literally. Animals don't have this. Okay, animal doesn't make a decision. If they're hungry, they want to eat. We can think, well, I can wait till lunchtime. An animal can't do that because their emotional center drives the behavior. In addicts, the emotional center drives the behavior. Can you see the conflict addicts go through? When they crave, this shuts down. If they don't deal with the craving, which we'll look at. It's the emotional center takes over all the reasons why I need to use the survival. I have to in order to function. That goes by the wayside. Tomorrow when they're sober up, this kicks in again. And this is where the guilt and the shame comes in. Why did I do this? Well, that's why you did it. There was no executive functioning taking place in the brain at the time. That can happen with craving when we are in recovery. Okay, lots of hands. Let's do one at a time.
Is that your conscious thinking shut down?
The conscious mind, the subconscious mind. Very good question. The conscious thinking shuts down. We can think, I'm going to get kicked out of the house, but it means nothing because this has taken over. Subconscious mind has taken over. Whereas the addict, because the difference between the two is one uses because they enjoy it, the other one uses because he has to. And they have to create a desperate situation. It's like if you go out at night onto your veranda, you see a long, thick black snake lying there. How many of you are going to go up to the snake and think, should I pick it up? Okay, would any of you? No. The amygdala in the brain that stores all the memories of negative experiences that gets triggered, danger. The brain is flooded with all sorts of stress chemicals, and this part of the brain shuts down because the more you think, the more you are at risk of being bitten. So the emotional center kicks in and you jump, you scream, you run away. There is no choice at that moment in time. It's survival. The same happens when there's craving. The emotional center takes over. The rational center shuts down. Now listen to this. It shuts down to stop myself from not using. How sick is that? The rational part of the brain shuts down because it doesn't understand drugs can kill me. This part screams survival. John needs to feel better. He's craving right now. He needs to stop the pain of craving. He needs to stop the emotional pain. This part of the brain does me a hell of a favor, shuts down so I can go and use and survive. Like the thinking part shuts down to stop me from picking up the snake and getting bitten. I'm in survival mode. That's the insanity of the disease. There's such a lot of stress chemicals being flooded here. Danger, 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 run away. And this starts to shut down to protect me from not running away. Because the longer I stand there and contemplate, the more at risk I am of being bitten. The same with craving. Craving tells me how I can relieve my pain. There's danger that John is in pain, he needs to use. This is doing me a favor by shutting down to stop me from not using in order to survive.
It's really only if you're standing there looking at it.
If you are at risk of danger, yes.
Yeah.
And craving tells me I'm at risk of pain if I don't use. Remember, the same part of the brain that gets triggered when a person starves to death is being triggered, and we're going to look at some of those parts that get triggered in the whole process. That's the whole idea, is to retrain ourselves, to distract ourselves by putting another thought into the whole process. Okay, so not only is there a dopamine problem, because there's too much dopamine that keeps me going back. And the more I go back, the less dopamine gets released, the more I need to use. Plus, the glutamate that entrenches the memory between the frontal cortex and the midbrain. There's also another part of the brain called the hippocampus, and the hippocampus facilitates the memory. And now the hippocampus works, all the information from the outside comes into the hippocampus, and there's a process there along with the glutamate chemical that now creates the memory. So it's a part in the brain that facilitates memory. And of course that part becomes impaired in addiction, where the addict only remembers the good things about addiction. The addict has got selective memory. When it starts craving, it doesn't remember the pain, doesn't remember the consequences, it doesn't care, because it's been trained to only remember the good things about using, the high, the escape, the numbing. So the hippocampus becomes impaired as well, in that only certain memories are accessed. So the more you try and warn your loved one, whom, of course, we can see when they are in relapse mode. Somebody mentioned the behaviors come back. And we try and reason with them. Don't do this. You're going to lose your job. You're going to go back to prison. It's in one ear and out the other. Because they don't even hear you bringing up the past. They don't hear you bringing up the consequences of what happened before. They only remember the good times. And of course, the memory of the good times releases dopamine. This was said earlier on, thinking about using is more exciting than the actual using for an addict, because thinking about using stimulates the VTA. Only the good memories are triggered.
Is that in the beginning in active addiction, or is that in recovery?
That can continue in recovery for a while. It's prominent in addiction, but even, this is where, what causes relapse, this kind of process. And we'll deal with it, what we mean by triggers that cause relapse. It could be any kind of trigger that sets this off. A smell that takes me back to the memory of using. Remember, this happens in the midbrain, it's unconscious. There's no decision in here. There's no choice in here. It happens by default. So can you see the whole process? Started off with the using. Wow. Remember how to do it. Now remember, don't forget next time, if you feel stressed, you know what to do. I don't remember the consequences and bad things, because that part of the brain has also been impaired. I only remember the positive things, the enjoyment. It only requires 30 milliseconds to be triggered, so we're not consciously aware of it. Clinically, as I said, it takes up to 2 years for those parts of the brain to heal. So that means for at least 2 years, the addict in recovery, practicing recovery, is at risk of relapsing. Because those parts of the brain, to some extent, are still relying on the drugs to function. It doesn't mean nothing changes before the 2 years are up, but we are not safe until at least 2 years. It gets worse. There's a structure in the brain called the rougher nuclei. And the rougher nuclei releases a chemical called serotonin. Serotonin is your well-being, calmness, chill kind of feeling. If it's Sunday, and you didn't have breakfast, and you are really hungry, and if you're lucky enough, your partner or your spouse prepared this amazing meal with all your favorite food, and you sit and you enjoy this meal, and afterwards you sit back and you think, wow, that was awesome. You think you're saying it because your tummy is full. No, that's not why you're saying it. You're saying it because there was a serotonin release that said, you've had enough, you can stop now, your needs are being met, you're satisfied. You really feel good. That's what serotonin does. So serotonin tells me I can stop something because it's met my need, and it makes me feel chilled, relaxed, satisfied afterwards. In addiction, over time, as part of the survival mechanism, the brain slows down the release of serotonin. This is why addicts have less and less satisfaction of using, Because not only do they not enjoy it anymore, there is no sense of well-being afterwards. The first couple of times they use, there's an incredible sense of well-being afterwards. This is why addicts in early addiction don't see the problem, because there are no negative consequences, and it's all dopamine and serotonin. But over time, less and less serotonin, so that's why one of the reasons why they can't stop. They're chasing the original high, and there is no mechanism in the brain that says you've had enough anymore. So they chase more and more and more. Plus, a lack of serotonin creates depression, creates anxiety, creates a terrible emotional state, which puts them more at risk of wanting to use more, because they want to get rid of all those feelings. This is why addicts, as I said earlier on, in early recovery, suffer from depression and anxiety, sometimes at a clinical level, because of the lack of dopamine and the lack of serotonin. There's no excitement and there's no sense of well-being. So there are medications that it's called dopamine or serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So the medication can help me, it causes the dopamine and serotonin that's available to stay in my brain longer. That's the scary part. The brain can run out of producing that, where it needs a long time to reproduce again, but you can run out. So the type of drug I used, how long I used, how often I used, the reasons why I used, can cause the brain to run out of dopamine and serotonin. Whereas the addict has that intense condition of anhedonia, depression, anxiety, because of this chemical imbalance that has not taken place. So they go back to the drugs to get rid of all those feelings. It gets worse. There's another part in the brain called the locus ceruleus, and then locus ceruleus releases norepinephrine. And norepinephrine is a chemical that gets released to say, there's danger, do something, there's a snake. You need to do something about that before it goes to the amygdala. Now the danger here is, John is craving, that means there's not enough drugs in your system. You need to start doing something about this. Serious. Remember, one leads to the other one. So it triggers, okay, I'll start thinking about using, dopamine release. The memory of using comes back. All the good things about using comes back, and I use. So in craving, all these factors come into play, and that is actually what gets me to pick up again. Because it sends the message, no drugs in the system, John is not coping, John is going to fall apart. Things are going to go seriously wrong here. And then the whole system comes into play. You can die because that can cause a drug overdose. You're so desperate, and of course after 5 years clean, the person goes back and uses the same amount they used when they stopped. That's why they OD. More addicts die in relapse than in active addiction. And the craving can be reduced, like somebody desperately needing a cup of coffee, but they're not going to die if they don't have the coffee now. So the craving is still there, but the intensity can become less. It gets worse still. There's a structure in the brain called the amygdala, and all the emotional memories of every single event I've ever experienced from the time I was born is stored in there. And of course, in addiction, a lot of it is selective, so it's got memories of the using in there. It's got memories of the reason why I started using in there. It's got memories of me being abused as a child in there, and the low self-esteem I grew up with, and being bullied at school, and running away from home, and I'm talking about my own life story now, landing up on the streets, all that kind of thing is stored in there, and the memories of getting rid of all those feelings by using is all in there. So all this process goes from one to the other, and eventually it comes through here. And that's where all the alarms, the red lights go on, survival, John is going to die. Because if he doesn't use, the memory of the pain comes in. If he does use, the memory of the relief. The amygdala is, apart from the locus ceruleus, they are the two main structures in the brain that actually cause me to relapse. While the rational part of the brain is in conflict, you can't do this, you're going to lose, and what is a terrible conflict. And of course the conflict triggers all of this. That's where the relapse starts. So the picking up is just a formality, and of course there's this hell of a downer in the actual picking up. That's extreme hypofrontality kicks in. This is not thinking anymore. Because this had shut down, this was getting very excited. The sick part is my addict destroys me, but it's also there to help me. It's there to help me deal with pain, with conflict, with stress. And the belief that says the only way I can get rid of the pain and stress and conflict is by using. Because the conflict, I know what the consequences are, but I desperately need to use. But John, if you use, your wife might leave you, but I'm craving right now. And my addict is saying to me, John, you know what to do. Don't be silly, you know what to do. But I shouldn't, but I have to. Okay, I'm going to use this piece. It's a war. And the more that war goes on, the more stress chemicals are being released, the stronger these processes are here. Well, particularly between, the hippocampus for that matter, the locus ceruleus and the amygdala. So if you want to blame anything for relapse, you can blame the hippocampus, the locus ceruleus, and the amygdala. Okay? And it's unconscious, it's not a conscious decision. And I keep repeating this because we need to understand that the moment the addict makes a decision to relapse, they feel peace. All the behaviors that follow from this, the scheming, the conniving, the planning, that takes intelligence to do that. So in this whole process, we tap into the most incredible potential to get what we need. It might be dysfunctional, but the thought, addicts can be ingenious. They just figure these things out. That talks about ability and potential. It's misdirected. So absolutely, we've got this a whole new way of experience. I don't know how to put it into words. It's a whole different way of being, like we said in the beginning. Okay, there's another structure in the brain called the insular cortex. And this part of the brain is constantly seeking pleasure. We are designed to enjoy ourselves. There's an inherent predisposition towards enjoyment, having fun, feeling good. But for healthy people, it tells you just go and have a cup of coffee on your own somewhere. Go to movies. Meet up with your friends. Go to a gym and have a good workout. The addict, it's been wired into the brain, pleasure means using. So if I'm stressed, this kicks in. If I'm happy, this kicks in. Addicts use because they feel miserable. Addicts use because they feel happy. Addicts use to celebrate. Okay, because of this part in the brain that has been affected by the drugs and the belief that the insular cortex even starts to tell me you need some pleasure in your life at the moment. There's no stress. There's no stress right now, but for some reason you can do with some more pleasure. And this whole process kicks in. And that also goes back, I'm able to make the decision, I'm taking control. And that's a basic human need. We all have a need to be in control.